What's happening, my friends? I just got back from a warrior poet trip. I do 2 of these a year. It's my own vacation. I take my family. And on this one, we had about 70 of you guys out there that went with us. I visited 3 bucket list places for me, which had a really profound impact. All of these had something really cool in common. And that is this. I realized all my heroes had death wishes. All right, guys, so the 3 spots that I visited, the first one was the sacred battlefield of Thermopylae. That's the hot gates. If you've seen the movie 300, I walked on that little piece of land. Now, the landscape is changed dramatically, so it's very hard to picture. One of my sons was just crestfallen when we got on that, sacred ground because they expected the water running up, but instead the water has receded dramatically as erosion from the mountain has run down. And so now it's not like this thin, hot gates, which the Persian army was funneling through. Now it's like this large, it's like a parking lot. It's a bus stop, but then you can kind of get up into the trees and you can really see the monuments. There's a Leonidas statue there, and there's a monument to the fallen 300 Spartan warriors that died there. If you're not familiar with this event, it was in the 5th century BC. There was Xerxes, which was king of Persia. In the Bible, this is Esther's husband, and he is coming through wreaking havoc all throughout Greece and really the known world. He was kind of king of the known world at that time. 300 Spartan warriors marched north throughout Greece to what's called the Hot Gates and stopped the Persian advance there long enough to be able to mobilize Sparta and much of Greece to be able to mount resistance against the invading Persian army. But it was really 300 warriors that had something of a death wish. It was a death errand. There was no way they were going to go and beat this Persian horde. All of them knew they were marching to their death. Now, they died epically, and they stacked bodies just like half a mile high, not literally, but it sounds cool. Hyperbole is fun. They killed a whole bunch of Persians in this pursuit. And so we remember them to this day. It's like an incredible feat. But any one of those Spartans could have, I'm calling in sick today, guys. It would have been so easy to avoid that fate. Disappear out of the mountains, get your family, and then run for the hills. Protect you and protect your own instead of marching toward a certain death and painful destiny. Instead, the Spartan warriors had a death wish, and that was they valued their countrymen and their families and also their own vainglory quest for valor to be able to launch out and have this death errand. Now, a fun thing that happened there that has nothing to do with really the content of this video, but was kind of too cool and epic to not include. My oldest son had a tooth that was loose, and he pulled it out at Thermopylae. And so he's got blood coming down his cheek. All these people think he's crazy.
Of course he pulled it out at Thermopylae. He did. Tossed it on the ground, and then he just wanted to fight.
That's right. He buried that tooth at Thermopylae. So now, his brag is he has bled on the fields of Thermopylae.
And there is a bit of Lovell on that battlefield.
That's it. And so we had a lot of fun over that. But I thought that was a really neat warrior impulse. I didn't tell him to do that. I didn't say anything about it. That was his own special. Let me bleed with the Spartans at Thermopylae. Let me leave a piece of me there. All right, so the first site really affected me, Thermopylae. The second one was Socrates' prison. When I was going to Greece, I didn't plan on even visiting this. I didn't know it was a thing until I was at my hotel in Athens, and I was just kind of searching around, doing a little map recon, and I was zooming in just what was right around us within a 10-minute walk, and I'm like, I'll be Socrates' prison. And I love the ancient philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the 3 greats. Socrates is considered really the father of philosophy. Now, there at his prison, some other folks came along with us. They were part of the trip, and my family was there. And we didn't have a tour guide for this portion, so everyone's just kind of looking around. I'm like, hey, there's the prison. I'm like, guys, do you know about this prison? Do you know about Socrates? And nobody really knew much. And so I'm like, I stepped forward, I straightened my collar, and I was just our de facto tour guide at this place. And I'm like, listen why Socrates is amazing. I love Socrates for this. Socrates was not some limp-wristed intellectual sitting in some ivory tower. I mean, he was a man's man. We know an account back around the time of the Peloponnesian War where Socrates runs out to protect his war captain, which is about to be destroyed, Alcibiades, and it's Socrates against this incoming horde, and he alone is saving his war captain until the ranks could kind of close in around him and rescue. But I think that's history as recounted by Thucydides. And so I'm like, man, Socrates wasn't just a warrior. He was like a special operations bad news warrior. Like he was super savage with a sword. It's reminiscent of Thucydides, who gives us the state that separates its warriors from its scholars, while its thinking done by cowards and its fighting done by fools. Socrates embodied that. He was warrior and he was philosopher, ever so much one of us. A warrior poet, someone who lives for higher purpose, ready to sacrifice in the defense of others, sees beauty and awe-inspiring truth and is ready to defend that to the death and live for it as well. And so the life, legacy, and death of Socrates still speaks to me thousands of years later. And so to be able to visit his prison, this warrior, consummate warrior, and a thinker of thinkers, he is called the father of philosophy. And it's rightfully so. From Socrates, we get something called the Socratic method. The Socratic method is just basically the process of asking questions. It's to really understand how we know what we know. So you'd ask a simple question, and then you would give an answer, and Socrates would come in and say, yeah, but what about under that? How do you know that? And then he would just basically drill down until you'd really shrug your shoulders and be like, I don't know how I know that. I guess I just assume. And so he's just breaking up all these root presuppositions, things that you think you know, and then after a series of questioning, you realize, I really don't know what I thought I knew. And so it forces us to think critically. And so kids in actual education, which we don't have that now, we have government schools, which are really doing indoctrination, and they're not teaching critical thinking skills. And so Socratic method is not taught. If it was, kids would actually be learning how to think critically for themselves. State's not going to let that happen because that's what Reformation and revolutionaries do. And I'm like, no, they're the people that challenge the status quo, that have new and dangerous ideas, which are an absolute threat to totalitarian control. And so the state's not going to ever let that happen. And it ended up being the state that killed Socrates. He asked too many questions. He challenged too many root presuppositions. He was intellectual phalanx against the dogma of the day. So Socrates asking all these questions, and people are really, light bulbs are starting to come on. It was upsetting the Athenian order, and so much so that he was told to be silent. Stop. You're upsetting, the status quo. Too many questions, and those are dangerous questions. And so ultimately they gave him a choice. You may exile, leave Athens, leave your country and never return, or death. And Socrates, desiring instead, up into the very end, he is still continuing to search for truth and share truth with his brothers and sisters to the left and right. And in his mind of like, well, to be cut off from my brethren is death already. And so he decided to stay and die rather than exile and go. It's something that's really hard for us to even understand in our day. But to him, exile was a death sentence already. But he would rather live and die fully himself than abandon that, save his own skin, and go into exile. I'm like, man, that's really believing in something. There's a famous painting. I'll throw it up right here. This is called The Death of Socrates. And so it was at this prison, Socrates pointing up as if he is still at the very end as he is dying. He is dying on that day. He's still arguing for truth, pointing up toward a higher ideal. And you see his friends around him, downcast faces, clearly upset, not wanting their dear friend Socrates to die, and he's being handed this cup of hemlock poison, which he's going to drink unto his own death. And so, man, what a harrowing story. It's no wonder we're still talking about him thousands of years later.
What stood out to me there is that he is operating within a political system that is corrupt. Mm-hmm. And from within the corruption, he still takes that stand. And that's the linkage between then and the modern day that stands out to me as really interesting, that he didn't flee it, but he stayed within.
Right. And his life is really a wild rebuke against the philosophers of our day. Typically, we haven't had philosophers in decades, barely any. I remember my very first philosophy class I took in college. And it was this gal, I wrote about this in my book, The Warrior Poet Way, because it was so irritating. I was ready to, hey, let's unpack truth. Let's really learn something. Let's really press in. But instead, this gal got up in front of class day after day, and she was just basically doing a survey of what other philosophers believed. And whatever we would press into and kind of like, all right, well, was this true or is it false? And she just kind of chuckle, and she was leading on this, buffet of just different philosophical systems. Now, some could say, well, that's her job. I'm like, well, I suppose so. Yes. Yes, it would be, but it's not a philosophy class. It's a history of philosophy class.
Yeah, that's a good distinction.
It's a history. And so that's important. And I wasn't ready for that. I was ready for a philosophy class. That wasn't a philosophy class. It was a history of philosophy class, which is different. We're just telling you what other philosophers believe. But this teacher herself, what did she believe in? We never found out. We were never going to find out. And it seemed like she didn't really care what conclusions we came to, just as long as she'd be able to unwind them, so we were just left completely in the dark. See, real philosophy actually goes somewhere. It starts to resolve. You're able to X out certain things that are absolutely not true, and you're able to arrive at certain things that are true. And then you're able to deduce and have inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. You're able to use the laws of logic to close out some options and get closer and closer toward an understanding of what real truth is. This is what philosophy has always done. It is a love of wisdom and knowledge that does build, and you learn things. Now, in our day, we're in the postmodern era, which basically is a deconstructionist time where we don't really believe in truth anymore. And so philosophy doesn't really have a place. Now, our day is one of anti-philosophy. We have given up on truth altogether, and we've decided that truth isn't really true. It's relative. If you believe something and I believe something and it's completely opposite, we're both right. And who is anyone to say that someone has any cornering on anything that might be true? And that's why men can menstruate and all this crazy, wild, upside down stuff. Why? It's because we gave up on philosophy. We gave up on truth. There is no capital T truth. It's all relative truth. And if truth is relative, then it doesn't exist. I love Socrates because he had a philosophy that he was willing to live by and die by. A true philosopher would not be able to keep their philosophy a secret. Let's move on to our third site, and this was even more profound than Thermopylae to me and Socrates' prison. It was another prison. This third one was in Philippi, Greece, and it was the prison where the Apostle Paul was kept. The Apostle Paul is arguably even more famous than Socrates, certainly more famous than Leonidas. And he, like the others, is a dude with a death wish. I have come prepared. I wanted to read a quote from him from a historical manuscript, which was a letter he wrote to Philippi in the first century. It says to this, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I'm to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet, which shall I choose? I cannot tell. I'm hard-pressed between the two options. My desire is to depart and be with Christ." That means I'm ready to die and go be with Jesus in heaven. And that's far better for me. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. And so Paul was a guy with a death wish. He wanted to die and go be with Jesus. He believed, because of this dramatic, wild conversion experience where he went from stacking Christian bodies, he would go from city to city, dragging them out, beating them, trying them, and seeing them execute. Hated Christians, and he was after them until one day something miraculous happened, which changed Paul forever. And now we have all these different historic manuscripts where we know the outlines of Paul's life And the first part of it, and then the second part of it, where he's constantly getting beat with rods, stoned, whipped nearly to death, starved, robbed, persecuted, hated, and then he's constantly in prison, and he spends the last years of his life in prison, constantly in court until they ultimately execute him. And his belief was this, that God had became a man and died for us so that our sins would be forgiven and that we could have eternal life through Jesus Christ. That was Paul's message. And the people hated him so much, they beat him constantly, threw him in prison, which we visited that prison, and then killed him for. These are historical facts. So now what am I to do with these three places? I mean, like, here's Thermopylae, here's Socrates, and here's Paul. And all of them very, very different. But I noticed some common threads. Let's look at the common threads. One is I look at all these brothers and say, warrior poets. That's our legacy. That's our heritage. That's part of who you are. Those are our forefathers right there. Folks who live for higher purpose and are ready to sacrifice in the defense of others. That's what it means to be a warrior poet. It's people who love truth and love people and are ready to defend both. And so I'm like, rock on. And so I want to revel in that fact that there's greatness in our rear view mirror, and they coach us all on. A second thing is I noticed they all showed incredible courage in the face of certain death and horrible fear. I'm afraid. I'm like, man, am I going to spend my last days in prison? Am I going to get taken out? These are real thoughts, and some of you may think that's sensationalistic. However, of like, man, I've just studied too much history to think that what has not been the certainty of yesterday won't be the reality of tomorrow. I can't come to any other logical conclusions. And I wonder, I'm so high on capital T truth in the fact that, you know, these kind of heroes and examples that lay before me, I'm obsessed with this. I'm obsessed with legacy. I'm a warrior at heart, and I aspire to grow to be more of a warrior and to be certainly more of a poet, which I think is actually more important. I want to live and die by truth. And so this is kind of a culmination. We're all moving to one thing here. The trick in life, it's not to live as long as you possibly can. The goal is not to live as long as possible. It's not to live as rich as possible. You don't get to take any of that stuff with you. It's not to have as much pleasure as humanly possible. Pleasure is like a junk food that can erode your soul, like eating fast food for every single meal. It becomes addictive with the dopamine hits, and eventually you end up living this completely poisoned, self-centered, narcissistic life where everything around you is destroyed by your appetites. The goal isn't comfort. Some people just want to be comfort, pain-free all the time. And again, that shifts you into this safe, meaningless existence where you're logging time but going nowhere. The trick isn't to live as long as possible. The trick is to find something worth dying for. And if you find something worth dying for, that thing is worth living for as well. The Spartans would say glory and the protection of their homeland. Socrates would say truth. And the Apostle Paul, who I think it's far better than the first two. I'm with Paul all the way here, and that's to live as Christ and die as gain. That's it. I think everything is about Jesus Christ, all of it. I think if God became a man, we should follow that man no matter what. And everything else looks pathetically pale in comparison. And that's where I land. But this video, Warrior Poets, this isn't a sermon, this isn't a church. The whole point here as warrior poet, which is wider than my personal theological beliefs here, is you want to live for something bigger than yourself. You want to find something worth dying for. And if you find that thing, that's also worth living for. The sights I saw around Greece remind me to break from the status quo and actually live intentionally. Now, not reactionary, not just logging time, but to live and die for what matters most. The biggest possible truth I can find and go all in on that. For those of you tuning in on podcast or watching on YouTube, we got a whole bunch more of the show, our Q and Ambush and our hot topics. You're really going to want to hit it out. In fact, we go deep into an argument regarding the climate cult that you're really going to want to check out, and much, much more. Sign up at watchwpsn.com. That's watchwpsn.com. Sign up there. You got a membership, and then you're able to download our app and see the full show, all of our other shows, all of our training classes. It helps us, and it'll certainly help you. So, guys, see you next time.